Well, welcome everyone. This is what I hope will be the first in a variety of interesting sessions. I don't want to narrow it down to any one type. They could be brainstorming. They could be, and we're talking about doing a brainstorming session in a couple of weeks on loss and damage. They could be more formal. They could be internal to IPAM. They could be a hybrid. But for today, I think we're honored to have Dr. Suzanne Moser, who is one of the leading lights in adaptation and adaptation metrics from the United States. And to introduce her, I'd like Joel Smith, an IPAM member, who suggested that she speak, to give an introduction. Over to you, Joel.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Good morning, Susie, and hello, afternoon, everyone else. It's about -10 Celsius here, is why I've got this sweater on. That's very cold. So it's my pleasure to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, and I call her Susie, Dr. Susie Moser. Let me just briefly introduce some of her highlights. And I think, as Carl said, she really is one of the leading thinkers on adaptation, really in the world. But Susie got her PhD from Clark University in geography, studying with the great Roger Casperson. And I think she's, since graduating, she's been a leader, whether at Union of Concerned Scientists, at National Center for Atmospheric Research, or as an independent scholar. She's really been a leader on adaptation in the US, I know, working with many communities, with states, the federal government, but also around the world. And one of the areas, and this is why I mentioned to Carl a few minutes ago, gee, we really need to have Susie speak, that Susie's really been a path leader, is on metrics. So almost 10 years ago now, Susie published a book with edited by her and Max Boykoff, looking at measuring success. Essentially, how do we define success in adaptation? And I think that really was a seminal piece of work. She's gone on to do other things, such as, and I recommend people look at her resilience metrics website. I know it's you and a team, Susie, but you're the leader of it, and among other things. And so I just thought, and I've heard Susie speak on metrics, and I think we'll enjoy hearing what she has to say. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to you, Susie.
Thank you so much, Joel and Carl and Karim, for inviting me. It's really wonderful to do this and to get our efforts connected somehow more formally. So I'm really excited about that. Let me share my screen and give you a sense of what I want to do. This is really a focus on what is happening in the US with adaptation metrics. Let me see. Okay, here we go. I just want to set a couple of sort of parameters on the outset, just so we are on the same page. This is an area, as you well know, strewn with jargon that people all interpret in different ways. So I want to make sure at least you know how I'm using the words that are sort of essential to this, and give you first a few examples of what is happening finally in America on adaptation metrics. And then introduce you to the toolkit. I call it the resilience metrics toolkit, but it is, the only reason we called it resilience as opposed to adaptation metrics is not just because you had that URL. No, because in the US at the time, we couldn't talk about adaptation or climate change in any overt way. So politically, it was not okay to talk about climate adaptation, and that's why it's called Resilience Metrics Toolkit. Anyway, and then I'll leave some room for the end. So just to start out, I don't need to belabor this, but I want to make sure you understand sort of the difference that we make in this work and that I'm using, and it is often used exactly the other way around. So I just want to be clear. The indicators as a sort of hint at what are the things that we're interested in, the qualities, the traits, the states of systems. And then the metric is the way you measure it. And just as an example, say you want to give, or want to look for an indicator for adaptation decision-making processes that are successful. Transparency might be one of those qualities, not the only one. You can open that box even more further. And, we use that because it's critical for trust building. Well, how would you measure it? Well, qualitatively, you might say, well, are available documents or information, is it free? Is it accessible on websites? And maybe in other forms. A quantitative one might be, taking a survey. So there's different ways of getting at any one indicator. And of course, many of the qualities of successful adaptation can be attached to many of its components, and I'll come back to that. It's also important to be clear about, what are people measuring? And I just, again, you know this, I just want to be sure. So are you interested in the performance of a particular agency, organization, or whatever that is adapting because they said they would, tracking how well they're doing that? So that's really input and action focused when you measure that. Are you interested in tracking effectiveness of adaptation strategies, which is ultimately what many of us are actually most interested in? That one would be far more focused on outputs and outcomes, but also to some extent the process and the actions actually taken. And then the last one is the issue of, so often discussed at the international level in climate negotiations. Is there enough money, and is there enough action actually happening? And that gets really more at the adequacy questions, looking at barriers, capacities, but to some extent also outcome and input. So I just want to distinguish, for many people, this is not a sort of a distinction, a clear distinction that they make, and it makes it even more difficult to integrate measures. Say, if every state tracks how well they're performing, does it actually ever tell us how good any of that is and whether it achieves the outcome or whether it's enough, right? So there might be a complementarity, but so I'll just put that out in front. And of course, globally now we do have a definition of success. When I started with this whole topic, as Joel said, more than 10 years ago, there's really no one who had set any benchmarks, had laid out any sort of definition of what are we aiming for. It's very vague. In some ways you could say the outcomes that we want are in that first phrase: adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. And issues related to effectiveness and adequacy come in through the other clauses of Article 7. What I think that actually points to, though, is really, really important. And that is that adaptation is far more radical than we often assume. It's not just a little adjustment on the margins. If you think about disasters, climate impacts undermining and to some extent undoing societal goals and achievements that we have made, say, in sustainable development, then the ultimate outcome of successful, based on this Article 7, actually is that we can achieve those goals regardless, these sustainability goals, regardless of the climate. And that means you have to not only reduce the disaster risk and minimize the impacts, the damages, but rebuild in line with the SDGs, address the root causes of risk and vulnerabilities, and actively transform the systems that essentially ignore all that, right? So it's actually a pretty radical agenda if we took that seriously. And so that raises big questions. Are we just interested in, someone basically rebuilding to a pre-disaster state, or are we actually as adaptation, or are we interested in far more systemic transformations? So, I don't think we have fully grasped the implications of Article 7 actually in terms of what it means for what we're counting. And of course, there's the perennial problem of where do we look and how do we integrate across these different scales? When you might measure something at a local project level very differently than at a jurisdictional level or at a sort of field building or global level. Also the questions of, which of those scales is relevant to look at, for whom, and when should we look? So I'll come back to some of these questions as we go. Now, let me sort of give you a few examples of what's now happening in the US. And as I said, 10 years ago, there was nothing. Now we actually have quite a bit of different types of activities going on. What you see here are federal and national efforts in dark gray. We have efforts at the local level, at the state level in blue, and somewhat in this bluish color here, also city efforts that are sort of embedded in larger networks. So for example, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or the Rockefeller supported RC100, the Resilient Cities initiative that they had for a while, C40. They all have their different approaches to this. There are some independent efforts going on driven by NGOs, and of course, rating agencies are slowly coming into this game, and academic research is happening largely independent of any of those things going on. So, but that's the sort of very rough outline of the landscape. And I want to give you examples from at least the federal level, state level, and local level. One NGO example, just briefly to walk through them, just so you get a flavor of what is out there. And I am picking some of the better ones out there. There are many things that are, I find, rather disappointing. They promise a lot, but don't give much. But, you know, anyway, be that as it may. All of this to say, it happens actually almost completely divorced from international experience. I'm not aware of anyone in the US who is aware of IPAM and your framework in the sense of actually using it or integrating some of the tools that you're offering. So, you know, this is one obvious way we can make headway, is creating that greater linkage. It's also largely divorced from UNFCCC, the Global Stocktake, or even from the SDGs. So this is, it's sad enough. There are very, very few exceptions to this. So let me start with a federal effort, which is by no means the you know, oldest or anything. It's actually very recent, as you could see by the date on this particular publication. There is an effort going on at Duke University in North Carolina that was essentially trying to provide guidance. They call it a resilience roadmap for the Biden administration. And it sort of became a vehicle by which some of us who are working on this were able to collaborate to provide input to, you know, this step-by-step guide of how to develop, as you can tell here, very managerial sort of approach to this, key performance indicators of climate change adaptation resilience. And so there is now at the Council on Environmental Equality, which is in the White House, an effort to coordinate the development of indicators at federal agency levels. And this is this step-by-step guidance to essentially help that process. This may actually lead to follow-on work with federal agencies through technical assistance and trainings. We'll see if it goes somewhere, but basically that was a really interesting collaboration to help bring the best of how do we do this and make it doable for federal agencies. There's another completely independent effort of a federal agency, namely the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, working as a funder, working with a private philanthropy, Climate Resilience Fund. They funded a couple of grantees, NGOs, consultants, and academia to develop these resources to support adaptation practitioners. And you see here, one is on measuring success. And that one is, this is the publication. I'm happy to share all these slides later so you can get to the links of these documents and can look at them. But basically, this is, you know, essentially walking people through how do you develop adaptation metrics and how do you evaluate how well you've done, what do you do with that once you have those indicators, and so on and so forth. All of this is actually, you know, pretty strongly influenced, I'm happy to say, with some of the thinking that we have done in the Resilience Metrics Toolkit, which I'll explain later. Here's an example from the state level. So in the US, when Trump came into office, you may be aware, many states, about half of the US states, came into a coalition called the US Climate Alliance to essentially still pursue the Paris Agreement goals without the federal government being basically part of it. Now we're back in the Paris Agreement, but this is an ongoing effort. It's become a coalition of the governors, essentially, or the states, to learn with each other of how to do certain things. And they've, in 2018, I think, developed the first playbook, if as they call it, climate resilience playbook, to essentially guide states. What are you doing? How do you do climate action in your state? And this is essentially walking them through adaptation steps one by one. And as part of it, there was a sort of development through a whole bunch of webinars that were educational, with state examples being presented, and much discussion among the state staff. And then through the support of a consultant, basically they wrote this playbook, and again, training may follow, because as we know, guidebooks alone are often not enough. Now, they have this step-by-step process here, as you can see, and one of them is focused on establishing a system for resilience measurement. They call everything resilience for the same reason, as I mentioned to you before. It's politically more salient often in the state. They have a very simplistic approach: input, output, outcome kind of thing. But they do point in the appendix to not only good state examples, but also to our toolkit, which I'm very glad about, to essentially walk them through really step by step of how to do that. Here's an example of one of those states that has a fairly promising approach. It's, by no means perfect. I think every one of them is in the process of learning. They established, as you can see here on the right-hand side, a framework, which essentially lays out areas of concern that need to address resilience. And they acknowledge in that that they go by this adage: you can't manage what you don't measure. And so then they have this playbook. It's its own playbook. I guess it's a common term now here in the US, where they walk people step by step again through how do you identify these measures. It is, the tracking performance measure in their context, and they come up with this really interesting concept, actually, a resilience value. So many things have value for all kinds of things, but it also has a value for resilience building. And here are some examples of the kind of measures that they would recommend. And, so they basically walk people in each one of these issue areas, what they call resiliency sectors, through establishing those the relevant measures. And then there is an annual tracking of that. There is a dashboard where you can basically find how well they're doing. The actual measures in that dashboard are still fairly limited, and some are more about vulnerability than about actually adaptation success. But it's anchored in what state stakeholders actually care about. So, how affordable is housing? So it's not just about making that housing secure, but it's also, is it affordable still? So those are the kinds of integrative measures that you find in that particular dashboard of tracking the progress. A local effort from Honolulu, Hawaii, or Oahu, the island of Oahu, and the county. This is one of the 100 resilient cities. This Rockefeller Foundation supported resilience process, and they had and still have an officer who does that work. And so, that comes with the whole learning community, right? And a sort of program-wide supported approach to this. Now, what they have done is they went through a lengthy visioning process with the community. I think they got inputs from over 2,000 people to establish a number of pillars of what matters the most for people in Honolulu, in Oahu, remaining rooted, meaning that it's still affordable to live on the island, that whatever they do, they're bouncing forward, not just back from a pre-disaster state, that they're climate secure, which includes both emissions and adaptation actions, and then that throughout there is still a sense of community cohesion, lots of leveraging the existing strengths, but also advancing that. Now, around each of these 4 pillars, there are, I think, something like 44 actions. Yes, 4 pillars, 12 goals, 44 actions. And just to give you a flavor of how they designed it, there's, for each one of those actions, there's a description of it, what the resilience co-benefits are. In other words, the action might have, again, many, many different goals toward this larger strategy, but for resilience, there might be specific co-benefits. They name the partners on each one, over what time frame to expect to have that implemented. They quite remarkably link it to the SDGs. I don't see that very often in the US. And then attach to every action a measure of success, one or more. So to me, this is a fairly nice way, an easy way to summarize what it do it, and they link it directly to an action, which oftentimes for people, that's the most visible thing, right? Is something happening? It doesn't necessarily tell us, or there's an assumed theory of change that if we take those actions, it all leads to good outcomes. And that's there's a lot of magic between action and outcome as to whether or not that happened. But it is linked to what people most care about in this way, that they can see action is happening. They also name very clearly, we want to be transparent and accountable. And so they now measure on an annual basis in their, what they call the sustainability report, how they're making progress on the issues. And very simplistically assess, this is the overview, there's a lot more detail on each one of those issues, whether they're in, making good performance, or whether it's still wanting, or whether it's stalled and there's no progress. So it's really holding themselves accountable and making that public. So that's just one good example locally. Here's one quick example from an NGO called the Multi-Solving Institute, which is not adaptation specific, but for a reason. It basically argues that climate is often not the driving force behind, people doing anything. So often they come to it because of jobs, or because of, expensive energy, or issues with water security. And so, this is about trying to measure to what extent do any actions in these issue areas, these very common ones that you see, are how often do they cause co-benefits for the others? And there's a process attached to it that is really about negotiating and bringing parties together, crossing the silos, which is so often necessary, right, for us to realize these co-benefits. So I think it's really an interesting approach to just simply, in a very simplistic but resonant way, capture what matters to the communities. Now, let me move in the direction of my own experience and the toolkit that I want to introduce you to. There are many ways to get to indicators and metrics. They might start from an action logic model, where you basically develop indicators for each of the elements in that action logic model and identify the metrics for it, and then simply do internal tracking through manual, or digital ways of simply checklists, have we done it? A very different way might be that you have a conceptual framework of success dimensions. I'll introduce you to one in a moment. And, how does that look in the real world? Can you find indicators for each one of those core dimensions, and then again, develop the metrics? Or you might start from a visioning process in which people just identify what matters to them. You do strategic planning to essentially move closer to that vision, and then attach your targets and indicators of success to steps on the way toward that vision of success. And again, moving from indicators to metrics. Now, in the example that I want to give you, I've worked with a community in Alaska, Houma, Alaska, where we did this latter process of visioning together, attaching it to strategic planning, and then developing the indicators and metrics from there. What was interesting about this particular series is that we basically took the stakeholders through a three-part workshop series, training series, really, introducing the basic issues around climate change, the steps of adaptation planning, and how to communicate that. That was done by a NOAA coastal program here. They basically have a standard training, and they bring that to communities that request it. And then we came into the process where we basically, did some scenario planning and looking at pathways to successful adaptation, where we started with a vision for both the little town of Homer, but also the Kenai Peninsula on which it sits on the tip end there, south of Anchorage, basically. We developed together relevant climate scenarios that would really make a difference in that context, and then identified sort of pathways with decision points or trigger points when they would have to go a different way or decide, going one way or another. And what we learned right around after that is that essentially it's very valuable, very interesting to the stakeholders, including the planners of the town and the region. And then they go home and they just forget about it. They just don't ever, think about it anymore because something is happening. We have this the saying, the boat leaks, right? Somebody, has issues that they need to deal with right away. Well, it turned out they really had a leaking boat in their harbor. And they needed to address those water quality and contamination issues right away. And so, we use that as a sort of entry point to think, well, we obviously need to first help these people solve the problems they have, but how do they solve it? Do they solve it to just basically, with disregard to the climate scenarios, with disregard to the vision, or can they actually relate it to that vision? And then basically make that very transparent and develop indicators for each of the strategies along the way. So I want to walk you through that in a very quick way. Essentially, we had, this initial work was having the climate scenarios that would matter in that location and the vision of what the community wanted. Then we focused on this current problem, and there might be a number of strategies of how to address that particular problem. Well, at that point, we basically asked them, is any one of these strategies, basically, is it consistent with, or will it interfere with, will it work still? Let me say it this way. Will it work under each of the climate scenarios that we discussed? And that, can cause some adjustments to the strategies, or maybe selecting one or another instead. And to what extent is it consistent with the vision that you had for the community? So basically 2 check marks of however you would solve your current problems. Is it workable under the different climate scenarios? And is it consistent with the vision? Does it lead you toward the vision you want? And then for each one of the strategies that were then still standing or were adjusted to account for those 2 things, we then developed, how would you know that you're making progress on that strategy? And from that, develop a particular way of measuring that. Specifically, let me give you one example. This had to do with an issue around, in the vision, there was an element of food security. It's a very isolated location, and when the one road to Anchorage is washed out by climate change, no food comes to that town. So food security is a big issue there. So a seed bank would be, establishing that would be the strategy. Now, how would you know that this is happening? They made a distinction between progress indicators and outcome indicators. So people actually using it would be the outcome, and, therefore being able to actually produce more of their own food. And so the metrics you see, very simple. Some of them are just simply yes, no, or simply a number that can easily be tracked. Those would be the ways to measure it. Now, this process, we did that for many of the different strategies. It actually ended up in the local comprehensive plan, which is the local policy document for this community. So we linked the metrics development very much to the actual development of their adaptation strategy that was embedded in the comprehensive plan. Now, let me then, say something about this toolkit. It draws on 4 projects over 10 years. The first one that was funded here by a NOAA subdivision of NOAA that basically looked at what are the key dimensions of adaptation success. I remember, Joel, you were part of that when we had those discussions, bringing both experts and practitioners together and say, how would you know that something is succeeding? That was very early on in the process. At the same time, Max and I wrote this book or edited this book, really pulling on what is out there. What do we know? There was nothing like that quite out there at the time. Came out in 2013. And one of the key things that we found is, why do people actually want to know about adaptation success? I think that's really important to think about. And, you know, your focus is particularly around the second one, around planning and decision making, but oftentimes it's a matter of having success measures to communicate a more hopeful story, to get people on the same page, to bring them together around something that is empowering, as opposed to this gloom and doom that we often talk about with climate change. For many, it's absolutely essential to have it as part of their justification for adaptation expenditures, for their applications for funding, to, you know, whether it's a private or a public funder, or to raise taxes. You need to know, what is it for and how would we see it? And then when you get that, you also need to show that you're doing good with the money that you got, right? So this accountability function, the good governance, showing the progress and evidence that you used your funds well. And then finally, and it's often quite different than the kind of metrics you might need for the other functions here, is to support learning and adaptive management. Imagine, for example, when you go to a funder, you don't want to necessarily tell them about failures, but for your own internal learning and adaptive management, you absolutely want to know about failures, right? At least temporary failures. So they're very different uses, and that's really important to get clear about. The other piece, I mentioned this before, through the work that Joel was involved in early on, we, you know, essentially said, how would you know that adaptation success is happening? And the experts and practitioners essentially said there are 6 dimensions. Each one of them is necessary but insufficient by itself. So whenever we're just interested in, you know, capacity building, not enough. If we're just interested in actions, the implementation of adaptation action steps, it's not enough. If you're only looking at outcomes, not enough. So essentially, we have to look at all 6 dimensions to get a really solid sense of whether or not a community or a state or a federal, you know, a country is adapting well. So that, to me, is a really important aspects to this. We might even say it's 7 dimensions when you take the sort of iterative nature in place. So it's not a one-time thing, but something that you institute to be able to do again and again. So very important. And that would actually drive, you know, again, what do you want to measure? When do you measure it? Now, from this, basically, from this initial learning, we basically said, well, it's nice to have these 6 dimensions, but how do you measure it? I had an opportunity to work with a national program here called the National Estuarine Research Reserve. There are truly estuarine research areas around the country. There are now 30 in the country, and I worked with 5 of them on the East Coast, in Alaska. The example that I gave you earlier was one of them, in California, to essentially get a, you know, just get a handle on how do we turn these 6 dimensions of adaptation success into things you can measure. And we've learned so many important things from that we decided it's going to turn into a toolkit that makes all this learning available to others. Each one of those locations was in very different places. They had, you know, had advanced to varying degrees with adaptation. Some, like in New Jersey, for example, they had just experienced Hurricane Sandy, and it was really a question of, do we know that we're in any better place now than before Sandy, after all the things that we've done? How do we know, right? So they had very different questions. In California, at the border to Mexico, people were really interested in how do we change the internal workings of our entity, and also bring this work to the region as a whole in San Diego. So very different contexts and very different stages of the process, but we felt that was a really good context in which to at least try this out. This is the outcome. You can find it very easily at resiliencemetrics.org. And what I want to do now very rapidly is basically to show you what's in it. So essentially, there is, you know, on each, there's a tutorial essentially on adaptation resilience. What does success mean? What is evaluation about? What are indicators? What are metrics? we're presenting our work, but also the work of other people. So this would be an obvious place where we can link to each other. We have examples of what that process of developing indicators and metrics looks like from the places that we worked. A whole bunch of testimonies, and nicely enough, not just from the people who were involved in it, but people who have used it since. So in other words, this is already taken off and going places, and we're learning, how it's helpful to people. We provide background information, contact information, just in case people keep wanting to get in touch with us. So here's an example of how we're using these 6 dimensions of adaptation success together with the different purposes that we have. You might be, interested in any a metric or indicator and metrics for each one of the 6 dimensions, but you might use it in very different ways. And so you get to a very different set of measures. And I'll just, again, very quickly just show you, we're really trying to resist to give people lists of metrics, but we couldn't entirely because that's what people want. It's a really interesting tension we can talk about. So we give them examples from our case studies of, for what are the strategies you might pursue? What are your goal? What's your indicator for it? How do you measure it? And what is it an example of? What dimension does it cover? And so we do that for infrastructure, governance aspects, economic aspects, environmental aspects, and social aspects. So that's just, here's just one example. We certainly find, that if you want equity to be a reasonable or a real issue in your adaptation success, it has to be included in each one of those 6, 7 dimensions. And we provide guiding questions to help people, assess that in their own process and sort of reduce that to a simple guidance here. I call it the 7 A's of equity and justice and engagement. So access to information, ability to attend meetings, accommodation for anyone who has challenges, acknowledgement of local circumstances and customs, attention to different types of justice, alignment of intent and meaningful engagement. Oftentimes it's just a checkbox, and we're trying to really get in the way of that. And actually, we encourage people to make anti-racist choices all along the way to not just, fix a symptom, but maybe actually address the system underneath it. And for all of that, we have basically these resources. So you can find them through a step-by-step process by searching for them through a search engine, or, as along the way as a supporting aid, if you will, through each of the processes that we offer. Now, you all are familiar with all the challenges of measuring success: methodological, conceptual, empirical, political. We recognize those, and our toolkit is very much aimed at providing possible solutions to them. This is sort of what we talk about throughout this entire process, but then we also provide these very practical resources, like how do you do a visioning exercise? How do you work toward, shared adaptation goals when people don't necessarily agree with each other, when there's conflict to resolve? How do you make good structured decision making that people could get sort of develop the decision criteria with you along the way? How do you prioritize of the many, many indicators and metrics that one could track, but nobody has the energy and time to do that? And how do you, how often do you have to measure them? It's just a sample of the resources that address some of these challenges that we have. Here, this is an example of where we help people figure out the funding for monitoring, which is, of course, a really big issue, right? So how do we help people identify, not only sort of how to go for the least expensive one, but where can they find support for it? And again, ways of support for identifying, choosing, and tracking these indicators through resources like you're seeing here. You can, when I give you this, you can basically get the direct link to each of them, or you can simply explore that toolkit. It's maybe because of all of those useful resources that the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is this standard go-to government provided toolkit for anyone interested in adaptation has listed it now as one of the places to help you with that. So that's been really nice. And maybe just to quickly say a few of the larger lessons we've learned is, people need to think a lot harder about how they want to use indicators and metrics and who they're for before they even get started, which is not something that they typically do. It's more like, oh, we must have indicators, and then they just sit around and nobody uses them. But in an age where everyone has capacity constraints and funding constraints, instead of having 50 that no one cares about, why have maybe just a half dozen that are really, really meaningful? But you need to have that, make that thinking ahead of time, basically, of who's it for and why do we need it. Also getting clarity on what it is that they're measuring, right? The issue that I mentioned earlier between performance, effectiveness, and adequacy. I always think it is, it's lovely to show with an example of how effective your adaptation is, but you've only done it in one place and you have a coastline, say, of 1,000 miles. Well, that's not enough. It's not good enough. We shouldn't, think that this is sort of the leading example. The leading example is when that becomes the practice all along the coast as as one context in which to do that. The singular focus on outcomes that so many people have is certainly not sufficient. And it's a tricky thing to work that and get people to understand that a lot of things need to happen before you get to outcomes. And having a more complex and comprehensive understanding is important. We did exercises with the various users we did this resilience toolkit with, whether they wanted a standard set of metrics or whether they wanted very tailored ones. And it's about 50-50. Some people say, I don't want to go through all that work. Give me just a standard set. And others say, no, those standards, they just are completely useless. They don't work for me. I need a very tailored set. And they're very glad with, this particular approach that we're offering. And maybe just the last thing to say is, there is so much work to make that happen. We tend to forget in our metrics obsession that really it comes down to the software, the communication, the transparency, the leadership to actually do this well and try something out and stay with it for the long term. So just, maybe a damper on all of our enthusiasm about numbers and indicators when really it's it's in the process of developing them together. So, my thoughts on just simple starts is to sharing the tools we all offer through our websites. Maybe there is a clever way to link and integrate our websites. Maybe there is something we could jointly contribute to the global stocktake on how to do this well. And, I think there are many opportunities for collaboration. I would love to learn more about yours before we go down that road, but I'll stop here and let's see, we have, I think, 15 minutes left for conversation.